In 2018, a small restoration project inside a regional German archive began digitizing boxes of old wartime letters. Most were ordinary: family updates, weather complaints, reassurances that everything is fine. Then, historians noticed a familiar signature. The letters were written by Erwin Rommel, one of the most respected and controversial commanders of World War II. But these weren't military reports. They were private letters to his wife, Lucy Rommel. That detail changed everything. Official documents show strategy. Public speeches show propaganda. Private letters show the person. At the time these were written, Rommel was leading German forces in the brutal desert fighting of the North Africa campaign. Temperatures were extreme. Supplies were scarce. Battles could turn in hours. Historians expected to find frustration, pride, maybe fear. What they did not expect was what Rommel wrote about the soldiers he was fighting. In one early letter, after describing tank movements and aircraft attacks, Rommel added a personal observation. "The British units we face are persistent. They withdraw in order, not panic. Their officers keep control even under heavy fire." This wasn't written for the public. There was no reason to exaggerate, no reason to impress anyone. It was simply a husband telling his wife what he was seeing on the battlefield. Another line stood out even more. "One must not underestimate them. They fight with calmness that is difficult to break." For historians, this was surprising. Wartime commanders often used harsh language for the enemy, even in private. But Rommel's tone wasn't hateful. It was analytical, respectful, almost professional admiration. One researcher later said, "It reads less like an enemy report and more like one soldier evaluating another." This raised a powerful question. Why would a German field marshal speak with such respect about the very army trying to stop him? The next letter would make that question even harder to answer. Weeks after the first letter, another one surfaced in the archive, written during one of the hardest phases of the desert campaign. Rommel had just come out of a brutal armored clash, the kind where tanks burned for hours and the desert floor shook like thunder. Historians expected frustration. They found something else. In the letter to Lucy Rommel, Erwin Rommel described a British defensive stand that had slowed his advance. But his tone wasn't anger. It was reluctant admiration. "They did not scatter when the first shells landed," he wrote. "Their officers remained visible, moving among the men. Even under heavy fire, they kept formation." This wasn't propaganda. No superior would read it. No newspaper would print it. It was simply one commander telling his wife what he saw through binoculars on a battlefield of smoke and sand. He continued, "It is difficult to force a collapse when discipline holds. They withdraw in order, not in fear." For historians, this line was striking. Wartime commanders often blamed enemy stubbornness or luck. Rommel instead pointed to training and leadership. He even admitted something rare for a field commander in the middle of a campaign. "We win ground, but not easily. Each position costs time, fuel, and strength." This was the reality of the North Africa campaign. Long distances, fragile supply lines, and an opponent that refused to crumble. Then came the most human moment in the letter. Rommel described British prisoners taken after the engagement, not with bitterness, not with insults, but with quiet observation. They were exhausted, covered in sand and oil, yet when offered water, they thanked our men politely. There is a kind of soldierly pride that remains even in defeat. That line changed how many historians viewed the Desert War. Rommel wasn't describing an enemy as a faceless force. He was describing men who endured hardship with discipline, just as his own soldiers did. This didn't make the fighting less deadly, but it revealed a professional respect between opposing armies, something rarely spoken of publicly during wartime. And in the final letter of the collection, Rommel would go even further. He would imagine a future no one expected him to consider. By the time of the third letter, the Desert War had changed. The easy advances were gone. The maps no longer moved in clean arrows. Fuel shortages were constant. Reinforcements came slower than promises. And in this moment of pressure, Erwin Rommel wrote to Lucy Rommel with a tone historians had not seen before. Less certainty, more reflection. He described another engagement with British forces, not a dramatic breakthrough, not a crushing defeat, just another exhausting struggle across endless sand. But what stood out was not tactics, it was perspective. One can predict their movements, he wrote, but not their endurance. Rommel admitted that British units often returned to the fight faster than expected. Positions thought to be broken would be held again days later. They do not give up ground easily. Even when pushed back, they prepare to return. This wasn't frustration, it was recognition. For the first time in the letters, Rommel stopped talking about winning and started talking about lasting. The desert, he wrote, punished both sides equally. Heat, dust, long supply lines. These were enemies no army could defeat. But he noticed something. They seemed to understand that this war here is not decided in a single clash, but in who can continue tomorrow. That line changed how historians interpreted the North African campaign. It showed Rommel realizing the war was becoming one of endurance, not maneuver. Then came the most personal passage yet. After describing the day's fighting, he wrote, "I sometimes wonder how these officers speak among themselves at night. They must be as tired of this sand as we are." It was a quiet moment of empathy. Not political, not emotional, but human. He wasn't imagining friendship. He was imagining shared exhaustion, shared burden, shared understanding of what it meant to command men in a place where nature itself felt hostile. For a German field marshal in the middle of World War II, this was an unusual thought to put into writing, even in a private letter, and yet, there it was. Not praise, not sympathy, but a recognition that the men across the battlefield were professionals facing the same relentless reality. Still, the final letter would go even further. It would contain a line that historians would later call the most unexpected sentence Rommel ever wrote about his enemies. By this stage of the desert campaign, the battles had begun to blur together. Positions changed hands. Maps were redrawn. Reports spoke of advances and withdrawals, but in his private letters, Erwin Rommel wrote less about territory and more about time. Writing again to Lucy Rommel, he described a growing realization. Victories in the desert rarely felt decisive. Even after a successful push, his forces were too stretched, too low on fuel, too dependent on fragile supply routes to fully capitalize. And he noticed the same pattern in the British. They return again and again, he wrote, not with dramatic force, but with persistence. Rommel had begun to see the North African War as something different from the fast-moving campaigns earlier in the war. This was not a lightning strike. This was a test of endurance. Heat damaged engines. Sand clogged weapons. Men operated on little sleep. Even basic supplies took enormous effort to move across the desert. In one passage, Rommel admitted something few commanders would ever put in writing. Nature here is the true opponent. The enemy simply shares the burden. That line stunned historians. It suggested he saw British forces not just as opposition, but as another army trapped in the same brutal environment, facing the same exhaustion, the same uncertainty, the same endless horizon of sand. He wrote about the strange rhythm of desert warfare, long days of tension, sudden violence, then silence again. After each clash, he wrote, we both pause, repair, and prepare, as if the desert demands equal suffering from both sides. This wasn't sympathy. It was recognition of shared limits, shared strain, shared dependence on leadership to keep tired men moving forward when nothing around them seemed worth fighting for. Rommel's letters were no longer about defeating an enemy quickly. They were about how long both sides could continue under relentless pressure. And that led him toward a thought even more unexpected, one that would appear in his final known letter from this period. As the Desert War dragged on, Erwin Rommel wrote less about quick maneuvers and more about the strain on men and machines. His letters to Lucy Rommel began to carry a quieter tone, less urgency, more reflection. He described days where nothing happened, and somehow that was worse. Engines broke down in the heat. Water had to be rationed. Sand worked its way into weapons, radios, food supplies. Every mile gained meant another mile of supply line to defend. And through all of it, the British forces remained, not always attacking, not always retreating, but always present. They do not rush, Rommel wrote. They wait, observe, and move when conditions favor them. He noted how British units often chose defensive ground carefully, forcing his troops to fight not just men, but terrain. Rocky ridges, narrow passes, elevated positions with clear lines of sight. They understand patience, he wrote. In this desert, patience is a weapon. This was no longer the language of frustration. It was the language of professional evaluation, the kind officers used when studying capable opponents. Rommel even admitted that British caution sometimes made them harder to defeat than more aggressive enemies. They do not waste strength. They trade space for time, and time is costly for us here. For historians, this revealed something important. Rommel was beginning to see the Desert War not as a contest of bold moves, but as a test of discipline, logistics, and restraint. In one especially telling line, he wrote, "One cannot despise an enemy who understands his limits." That sentence carried weight. It suggested that in the isolation of the desert, far from politics and propaganda, what mattered most was competence, the ability to keep an army functioning under extreme conditions. Rommel wasn't admiring ideology. He was respecting professionalism, and that respect had grown slowly, battle after battle, letter after letter. But in the next and final letter, he would go beyond respect for battlefield skill. He would write something far more personal. By now, the Desert Campaign had become something different in Erwin Rommel's letters to Lucy Rommel. He still mentioned positions, supply shortages, and the constant struggle for fuel, but those details were no longer the heart of his writing. Instead, he spoke about the men. He described how both sides were reaching a point where exhaustion shaped decisions as much as strategy. "There are days," he wrote, "when movement depends less on orders and more on what the men can still endure." He observed that battles were no longer explosive, sweeping affairs. They were slower, heavier, measured in small gains that cost disproportionate effort. What struck historians most was how often Rommel referred to the British not as the enemy, but simply as the opposing forces. The language of a professional soldier, not a propagandist. He wrote about how both armies paused after engagements, not out of mercy, but necessity. After each clash, both sides must repair engines, treat wounded, and reorganize. The desert enforces this pause. This idea appeared again and again in his letters. The environment dictated the rhythm of war, not speeches, not ambition, not ideology. Heat, distance, sand, and limited supplies reduced even powerful armies to the same fragile state. Rommel began to recognize that the British commanders facing him were making many of the same calculations he was. When to push, when to hold, when to conserve men and machines for another day. "One sees in their actions the same caution we are forced to adopt," he wrote. "Not hesitation, preservation." This was not praise. It was acknowledgement that survival in the desert required restraint, and that both sides understood it. In one quiet passage, he admitted something that revealed just how much his perspective had shifted. Victory here belongs not to the boldest move, but to the side that can continue when boldness has faded. That sentence showed Rommel grappling with a hard truth. The Desert War was grinding both armies down, and success depended as much on endurance as on skill. And yet, in the next letter, he would go further still. He would write not about armies, but about the men who led them. By the time of this letter, the desert had worn away more than equipment. It had worn away illusions. In his writing to Lucy Rommel, Erwin Rommel no longer described battles with the sharp energy of earlier campaigns. His tone had slowed. His observations had deepened. He had begun to see the British forces not just as an obstacle, but as a reflection. "One recognizes patterns in their decisions," he wrote, "because they are the same choices we must make. When to risk an attack, when to delay, when to pull back to save men for tomorrow." He noticed how both sides sometimes paused after contact, not because of fear, but because pushing further would break the very forces they needed to continue the campaign. "They understand preservation," he noted. "So do we. It is not weakness, it is necessity." The desert, he believed, stripped war down to its most basic truth: survival. Grand plans faded in importance when engines overheated, water ran low, and men collapsed from exhaustion. Under those conditions, every commander was forced into the same narrow set of decisions. Rommel wrote about watching British movements through binoculars and recognizing something familiar. "Their caution mirrors our own. Their pauses resemble ours." It was a remarkable admission. He was not saying the two sides were the same politically or strategically. He was saying that, at the level of command and survival, they faced identical burdens. In another passage he wrote, "One learns to read the enemy not as a stranger, but as another officer bound by the same limits." For historians, this line was powerful. It showed Rommel understanding that the men across the battlefield were constrained by the same realities he faced: terrain, supplies, fatigue, and responsibility for lives under their command. The war in North Africa had become less about dramatic breakthroughs and more about measured endurance. And in that slow grind, Rommel saw something unexpected. The enemy had become a mirror reflecting his own challenges, fears, and decisions. But in the final letter, he would write a single sentence that went beyond professional respect. A sentence that suggested he imagined a future beyond the battlefield itself. As the Desert War dragged into another brutal phase, Erwin Rommel wrote one of his most reflective letters yet to Lucy Rommel. It was no longer just about terrain, supply lines, or maneuver. It was about responsibility. Rommel described how each decision now carried heavier consequences. Reinforcements were limited. Equipment wore out faster than it could be replaced. Every offensive had to be weighed against what it might cost days later. "Command here feels different," he wrote. "Every gain asks a question. Can we afford what it takes to hold it?" What surprised historians was how often he connected this burden to the British commanders facing him. He had begun to see that they were under the same pressure, making similar calculations, forced to balance aggression with preservation. "They do not act recklessly," he observed. "Their restraint tells me they carry the same weight of decision." Rommel wrote about watching British movements and recognizing a familiar hesitation, not fear, but caution born of responsibility. The kind of caution that comes when every order means lives spent or saved. One senses they measure risk as carefully as we must. This wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement of shared command burdens in an environment that punished mistakes instantly and severely. The desert gave no advantage to pride or ambition. It rewarded preparation, discipline, and leaders who understood the limits of their men. Rommel admitted that the psychological toll of command was becoming as heavy as the physical strain. "The hardest part is not the battle," he wrote, "but deciding when the battle must wait." For historians, this was one of the most human insights in his correspondence. It showed Rommel thinking less like a symbol of war and more like a commander responsible for the survival of exhausted soldiers. And it revealed something rarely spoken of in wartime narratives. The enemy commanders he faced were likely losing sleep over the same decisions. But in the next letter, the last one historians believe from this period, Rommel would go beyond shared burden. He would write a sentence that sounded almost impossible coming from a battlefield commander in World War II. By now, the Desert War had settled into a harsh rhythm of survival. In another quiet letter to Lucy Rommel, Erwin Rommel wrote with a tone historians describe as unusually reflective for a field commander in active operations. He no longer described the British simply in terms of positions, strengths, or weaknesses. He wrote about what they endured. Long marches under the sun, nights repairing machines by dim light, the constant uncertainty of when the next engagement would come. One begins to see not just movements on the map, he wrote, but the effort behind each of them. This was a remarkable shift. It suggested Rommel was imagining the human labor behind the enemy's operations, the same labor he saw every day among his own exhausted troops. He described watching British convoys through binoculars and noticing how slowly they moved across rough terrain, how often they stopped to regroup. They conserve strength carefully, he noted. Waste here is punished immediately. In one passage, he admitted that the desert stripped away many illusions about war. Here, there is little room for grand gestures, only steady work, day after day. For historians, this line showed Rommel recognizing that the campaign was less about dramatic victories and more about persistence, the willingness of both sides to keep functioning under punishing conditions. Then came a sentence that revealed how far his thinking had evolved. One cannot help but see that the men opposite us endure the same hardships we do. This was not sympathy for an enemy nation. It was recognition of shared physical and mental strain. Rommel understood that leadership in the desert meant making hard choices with limited options, and that British commanders were doing the same. He wrote about the loneliness of command, about making decisions that would never be fully understood by those far from the front. From a distance, war appears simple. Here, it is a constant balance between necessity and loss. That line struck historians as deeply personal. It revealed a commander wrestling with responsibility, aware that every decision carried unseen consequences. By the end of the letter, Rommel's tone had shifted from describing an opponent to describing a shared experience. Not shared goals, not shared causes, but shared burdens. And in the very next letter, the final one historians believe from this period, he would write a single line that sounded less like a statement of war, and more like a reflection on the men forced to fight it. In one of the last letters before the campaign shifted dramatically, Erwin Rommel wrote to Lucy Rommel with a kind of calm that historians found striking. There was no excitement in his words, no talk of glory or rapid victory. Instead, he wrote about character. He had come to believe that the Desert War revealed something deeper than tactics or technology. It exposed the inner strength and limits of the men leading and fighting it. Machines fail, plans change, he wrote, but what remains is the resolve of those who continue. Rommel described how prolonged hardship stripped away illusion. There was no dramatic heroism in the endless sand, only steady effort, discipline, and the will to keep functioning when comfort and certainty were gone. He saw this not only in his own troops, but in the British forces across the battlefield. They endure quietly, he noted, not with dramatic gestures, but with consistency. This observation surprised historians. It showed Rommel valuing steadiness over boldness, reliability over spectacle. He had begun to see the Desert Campaign as a kind of long trial, not of strength in a single moment, but of character over time. Who could stay organized when exhausted? Who could remain disciplined when progress was slow? Who could lead men through weeks of strain without losing focus? In such conditions, he wrote, one learns much about the men one faces. This was no longer a description of enemy capability. It was an assessment of human qualities: patience, restraint, responsibility. Rommel acknowledged that British commanders showed the same careful approach he was forced to adopt, balancing risk against survival, knowing that every decision might shape the weeks ahead. Their caution is not weakness, he wrote. It is understanding of what this place demands. For historians, this letter marked a clear evolution in tone. Rommel was no longer writing primarily as a strategist. He was writing as a commander reflecting on the kind of leadership required to endure a campaign where nature itself was an adversary. And in his next letter, the last one historians would recover, he would write a single sentence that went beyond professional respect. A sentence that sounded more like a reflection on shared humanity than on war. As the Desert Campaign continued, The letters from Erwin Rommel to Lucy Rommel grew more introspective than ever. The battlefield reports still existed, of course, numbers, positions, fuel estimates. But in private, Rommel wrote about something those reports never showed: the loneliness of command. He described nights when the noise of engines had faded and the desert wind was the only sound. Moments when decisions made during the day weighed heavily, long after the fighting had stopped. "The map looks simple," he wrote, "but each mark upon it carries consequences that cannot be erased." What surprised historians was how often he connected this burden to the British commanders facing him. He no longer saw their caution merely as a tactical choice. He saw it as a sign of shared responsibility. "They must measure their actions as carefully as we do," he noted. "One does not move men lightly in this place." Rommel wrote about the strain of deciding when to attack and when to hold back, knowing that either choice could lead to losses. In the desert, mistakes were rarely hidden. They were immediate and costly. "The hardest part of leadership here," he reflected, "is not issuing orders, but living with them afterward." For historians, this was one of the most human passages in all the recovered letters. It revealed a commander thinking beyond objectives and outcomes, focusing instead on the weight of responsibility carried by those in charge. Rommel recognized that the British officers across the battlefield faced the same sleepless nights, the same calculations, the same fear of wasting lives unnecessarily. This realization did not lessen the conflict, but it deepened his understanding of the men directing it. "We stand on different sides," he wrote, "yet we carry the same burden of decision." That line hinted at something deeper than professional respect. It suggested Rommel saw a shared experience among commanders, a common psychological strain imposed by the Desert War, and in his final known letter from this period, he would take that thought one step further. Writing a sentence that historians still quote today as one of the most unexpected reflections from a battlefield commander of World War II. The final letter historians believe came from this period was not long. It did not describe a major battle. It did not announce victory or defeat. Instead, Erwin Rommel wrote to Lucy Rommel in a tone that felt almost removed from the battlefield itself. He had spent months watching the same horizon, fighting the same enemy, enduring the same sand, heat, and uncertainty. And in that final letter, his focus shifted away from movement on the map to the men who carried it out. He reflected on how both sides had adapted to the desert, how survival required discipline, restraint, and constant awareness of limits. He no longer described the British primarily as opponents. He described them as soldiers shaped by the same environment. Then came the sentence that stopped historians when they first read it. "If fate had placed us in different uniforms, we might have served much the same way." It was not praise of an enemy nation. It was not political agreement. It was not sympathy for the cause they fought for. It was an acknowledgement of something simpler and more human: that professional soldiers, placed in similar conditions, often think and act in similar ways, regardless of the flag on their sleeve. For historians, this line reshaped how they viewed the desert campaign through Rommel's eyes. It revealed a commander who, in private moments, saw beyond propaganda and ideology to the shared burdens of those ordered to fight. The war remained brutal. The losses remained real. Nothing in the letter softened that reality. But it showed that even in one of the harshest theaters of World War II, a commander could recognize the common experience of leadership, exhaustion, and responsibility on both sides. In a conflict defined by divisions, Rommel's final surviving line from this series of letters revealed an unexpected truth. Sometimes the men facing each other across a battlefield understand each other more than anyone else. And that understanding, quietly written to his wife in a letter never meant for history, became one of the most revealing insights into the mind of a desert commander. The final letter historians believe came from this period was not long. It did not describe a major battle. It did not announce victory or defeat. Instead, Erwin Rommel wrote to Lucy Rommel in a tone that felt almost removed from the battlefield itself. He had spent months watching the same horizon, fighting the same enemy, enduring the same sand, heat, and uncertainty. And in that final letter, his focus shifted away from movement on the map to the men who carried it out. He reflected on how both sides had adapted to the desert, how survival required discipline, restraint, and constant awareness of limits. He no longer described the British primarily as opponents.